Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for tuning into Koshur Musalman. This is our 8th podcast, and in this podcast today we'll be joined by Professor SherAli Tareen. Professor SherAli has been teaching at Franklin and Marshall College since 2012. He received his PhD in Religion and Islamic Studies at Duke University, and his work centers on Muslim intellectual thought in modern South Asia with a focus on intra-Muslim debates on crucial questions of law, ethics, and theology. His book Defending Muḥammad in Modernity was published in 2019 as paperback from the University of Notre Dame Press. In this podcast today, we'll be talking about how any conversation on decolonization is incomplete without a critique of secularism and its forms of power. We'll be trying to question the validity of secularism's claims about itself and also its attempts at remaking Islam. We'll be evaluating the different dichotomies like good Muslim, bad Muslim, moderate Islam, extremist Islam that secularist historiography produces. We'll also be trying to critique liberal discourse on decolonization in Kashmir, Palestine, and elsewhere, and the inherent Eurocentrism of it. And lastly, we'll be trying to interrogate the popular romanticization of a pre-BJP secular India. So, Professor SherAli, I read your book Defending Muḥammad in Modernity, and I have to say that you do a brilliant job at narrating the discussions that happened amongst Muslims on the questions of political theology, divine sovereignty, and law and ethics. But what really captured my attention was the way you problematize and question the Eurocentric reading and framing of Islam and Muslim thought. So you argue that categories like good Muslim, bad Muslim, moderate Islam, extremist Islam, political Islam, apolitical Islam are products of a secular liberal epistemology, a secular liberal knowledge system that fails to comprehend Islam on its own terms. And you also argue that at the heart of such a secular liberal reading of Islam is the desire to excavate an Islam or to construct an Islam that is compliant to liberal political rule. Could you elaborate on this?
Thank you so much, Ahmed. First of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me to this amazing new podcast that you've started, and I want to congratulate you for this great initiative of Koshur Musalman. I think it's an excellent initiative, and I'm really honored and privileged to have been invited on this podcast. And thank you for your question, which really shows the very close reading you have done of the book, and you've really gotten to the heart of the kind of conceptual and political intervention that the book tries to make. So I really want to thank you on your close reading. So yeah, absolutely. In some ways, the dual purpose of the book was, on the one hand, to present a reading of the Muslim intellectual tradition, especially in early modern and modern South Asia, but then also to connect it to the larger intellectual traditions of Islam more broadly. And to show the depth, the ambiguities, the conflicts, the debates, and their logics, their internal logics with some detail. But in addition to that, to do that as a way to question the kind of liberal secular framings that are oftentimes presented as a way to make sense of these kinds of debates. So this debate that I talk about between two major groups of Muslim traditionalist scholars in South Asia in the 19th century, the Deobandis and the Barelvis, whose debates and whose disagreements to this day cast a very penetrating shadow on South Asia and in diaspora communities around the world. Oftentimes, the framing that is presented to this debate, the kind of popular and even many scholarly views of this debate, is to see it as some kind of a contestation between legal scholars and mystical scholars, or the good Muslims and the bad Muslims, inclusivists and exclusivists, those who are all for shrine visitation and the veneration of pious saints, and those who are sort of opposed to that. Basically people who are Puritan banner bearers of the Sharia, and others who are committed to Sufism or the mystical tradition in Islam, which is oftentimes caricatured as a sort of peaceful, inclusive form of Islam. So these kinds of framings, the underlying sort of reason why these framings gain the kind of popularity and the kind of weight that they do is precisely because of this desire to compartmentalize religious thought and life. So among the central sort of promises of liberal secular thought and power is precisely to compartmentalize disciplined life, religious thought and life in a manner which would be palatable and which would be digestible to a liberal secular framework. So you're absolutely right in pointing out that among the major purposes of this book, by presenting a detailed and complex reading of this tradition, was precisely to interrupt and disrupt this kind of a liberal secular framing that is oftentimes presented to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what I want to ask you here is that when Western scholarship and their politicians, and also some of the Muslims who see themselves through a Eurocentric gaze, when they call a particular interpretation of Islam as good Islam or moderate Islam, and another interpretation of Islam as extremist Islam or bad Islam, what is it that Islam is being compared to, as a result of which it either appears good or bad, as a result of which it either becomes moderate or extremist? What I mean to ask you is, what is the yardstick that is being used to judge Islam and assign values to particular interpretations of Islam? Is it simply that an Islam that is heavily regulated by liberalism is considered to be a good Islam, and an Islam that refuses to remake itself in the image of liberalism, or at least in the image of Protestant Christianity, such an Islam is rendered as extremist Islam or bad Islam? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, the key question there when we use these kinds of categories like moderate Muslim or moderate Islam is who will get to decide the yardstick or the measure through which moderation will be evaluated? Under whose worldview will the idea of moderation be evaluated and measured and judged as such? So, even if you look at the etymology of this term moderation, which comes from moderare, which means to control, tame, and domesticate, control and domesticate, tame life, which basically means that you have some kind of an entity, you have some kind of thought, you have some kind of an entity, and you basically become moderate by not being that thing that you are. So that's at the heart of the word moderation. You are only moderate when you have been properly tamed, when you have been properly controlled, when you've been properly domesticated. So you have to separate yourself from yourself in order to be quote unquote moderated. You have to be moderated by an external power, by an external worldview, in order to be properly called the moderate. So in some ways, that is, a moderate Muslim is really a Muslim who is not really a Muslim, right? So, by which I'm not saying that people who call themselves moderate Muslims are not Muslims. I'm not passing some kind of a theological judgment here, but I'm just going to the heart of the conceptual kind of field in which these kinds of categories take hold and take shape. So oftentimes, of course, the definition of what moderation is, or the yardstick by which moderate is judged and is evaluated as such, is of course a yardstick which comes from liberal secular conceptions of good religion. Good religion, according to a modern secular notion of religion, is religion which is not really religion, which is circumscribed to the private sphere of the family or the individual, which is religion which is sequestered to the inner part of a person's life, inner belief, which does not really care much or is not really invested much in external forms of rituals or forms of authority, whereby people decide for themselves what their moral lives should look like, and not take the advice or the directions or the authority of external forms of authority like religious scholars, Sufi masters, etc. Or the good religion is the religion which oftentimes in the West, but increasingly in all societies, we hear this nauseatingly superficial phrase, but very powerful, but nauseatingly superficial phrase: I am spiritual, but I'm not religious. So the definition of spirituality there is it's something which is being constructed, which is being defined in relation to this other thing called religion, but it is not really religion, right? That's basically the idea of moderation. You are Muslim, but not really Muslim, the moderate Muslim. So clearly, the conceptual sort of underpinnings of this idea of moderate Islam and how it is then separated from something called extremist is very conceptually unstable. It can be very easily deconstructed, and it is implicated in some very nefarious politics. So, just to take an example from my book that you mentioned, this whole discourse of the good Muslim, bad Muslim, whereby Sufism somehow is championed as the good kind of Islam, which is unconnected to external rituals, or which is the opposite of this other Islam called the Islam of the Sharia, uh, gets implicated in this kind of politics post 9/11, where many think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, Rand Corporation, etc., wrote all these influential papers to build Sufi universities in places like Pakistan, elsewhere, to curb the rise of Puritan Islam, or actually, to go back 20 years, the Taliban, etc. Some histories come back to haunt you, which has had massively problematic results on the ground, which has caused a lot of problems on the ground, which has actually led to even more pathological expressions of prophetic love on the ground when it comes to discussions on blasphemy, etc. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this discourse of the moderate Muslim is both conceptually unstable. It has some underlying conceptual problems, and it gets implicated in some very powerful and nefarious politics of producing a good kind of religion, which is then to be separated from sort of bad religion, etc. And especially when it comes to Islam and Muslims, this is a very pervasive phenomenon. The last thing I will say is that Muslims themselves, especially in the West, but also in other societies, these ideas, that the normativity of these ideas permeates rather quickly, especially in the age of social media, etc., that Muslims do themselves a huge disservice when they adopt these kinds of categories of the moderate Muslim, when they submit to the arbitrating authority of liberal secular power, when they themselves are eager to separate themselves from this thing called a Muslim identity, which is a very defensive move, which is a very apologetic move, which is conceptually noisome and politically nefarious. So especially you see this in the Western context of Muslims, but all over the world today we see that. And oftentimes, the defense which is presented is that, oh, moderate is a category which is also found in Islam. So there is this other sort of discourse that, oh, in Islam also you have categories like i'tidal, or ummah wasatiyya, the middle sort of community, etc., the community on the middle path, or mayana rawi in Persian, all these categories in Persian, Arabic, Urdu, that corresponds to moderate. So my response to that would be that these different categories in Islam, the idea of moderation there has to do with justice, of being just, of curating a just individual and society. These concepts do not equate to the nefarious liberal secular politics of submitting the task of moderating religious subjects to the modern state. See, that is the underlying sort of pivot around which liberal secular power operates, that the whole power to arbitrate and moderate religious lives and subjects is handed over to the modern state. That is very different from this modern liberal secular discourse of moderation, is very different from these categories that you find in Muslim thought. So we need to challenge and we need to disrupt these kinds of claims, precisely by combining intellectual work with connecting them to the politics which are implicated in this intellectual labor.
So, Professor SherAli, when we speak about secularism in today's world, one of the very common and popular ways of thinking about it is that secularism simply means the separation of religion from politics, or the separation of religion from the public realm. Such an argument, however, presupposes the timeless, the universal, the natural existence of religion and politics as two distinct realms, as two distinct essences that secular power seeks to separate and remove from each other. Now, when we go through the works of Sabah Mahmood and Talal Asad, what we realize is that these notions of religion and politics, or this dichotomy of the religious and the political, is not natural, it's not neutral, and it's not timeless either. Rather, as Sabah Mahmood argues, secularism is not the separation of religion from politics. It's not the absence of religion. Rather, it's a normative project that produces these very spheres of the religious and the political, establishes and regulates their boundaries, and suffuses them, permeates them with content and meaning. To put it simply, secularism is not the separation of Islam from politics. Rather, it is the reconstruction or the redefinition of what Islam is and where it belongs, which, according to secular political theology, it belongs in the private, individualized sphere of life, and what politics is and what ideas should govern politics, and according to secular theology, it's liberal politics that is considered to be the only form of valid, rational politics. So, Professor SherAli, you have built a lot on Sabah Mahmood's works, and throughout her work, she asks us to rethink the moral superiority of the secular vision that is taken for granted in today's world, and she also asks us to question what we take to be the truth of secularism, its claims, and its assumptions. So, what would you say about all this?
Yes, the way I read someone like Sabah Mahmood and different scholars, connected to her sort of line of thought, what we might call critical secularism studies, which really has been an important field of study in anthropology and religious studies and the connected humanities in the last 15 to 20 years or so, is the question of what are the kinds of questions, discourses that are foreclosed if you readily and unquestioningly embrace the conclusive normativity of liberal secular power and its assumptions about religion in the modern world. Embrace questioningly liberal secular assumptions about what good religion looks like or what good religious people in the modern world look like. What are the kinds of alternate logics of life, discourses, questions, and avenues of thought that will be foreclosed if you do that? That, in a certain sense, is at the heart of the kind of inquiry that someone like Sabah Mahmood has conducted in her various writings, in her prolific and really critical career. And at the heart of the argument, then, of course, is that this commonplace conception that the religious and the secular are opposites of each other, or the inverse of each other, that when you become more secular you become less religious and vice versa, etc., is a very impoverished way to think about these two categories. And rather, secularism ought to be thought about as a form of power that constantly regulates and manages and defines what religion in the modern world should look like. Now, that notion of good religion, in turn, is one that does two things. One, it produces a kind of religion which is conducive to modern state sovereignty, which is conducive to the governance of the modern state, be they Islamic or non-Islamic, Western or non-Western. So secularism permeates different societies in different ways. It becomes part of the political rationality of different modern nation states in different ways, whether that is Egypt or Pakistan or the US or France. The trajectories are quite varied and different, but the ways in which secular power seeks to authorize modern state sovereignty and the governance of the modern state is something which is in which it has in common, which is at the heart of the very structuration of the modern state, as Sabah Mahmood would put it. So that's one thing that it does. The second thing is that it produces a notion of good religion, which is at peace with a certain modern Protestant notion of what good religion is or should be like in the modern world. Now, Protestantism, of course, is a diverse tradition, but in some ways, its signature precepts are that good religion is religion which is sequestered to the private sphere of piety, which is sequestered to the individual and the household, where inner belief is privileged over outer rituals, where the human subject gets to decide for herself what ought to be done in terms of charting her moral life. You don't listen to external forms of authority, the church, the mosque, the ulama, Sufi masters, etc., where spirituality is privileged over official religion, and so on and so forth. So the way in which these two things cooperate with each other, political secularism as an alleged doctrine about the separation of religion and politics that is conducive to the organization of the modern state's sovereignty and governance, and then this notion of good religion, which comes close to a certain modern Protestant notion of what good religion should look like. How these two things cooperate with each other, political secularism and secularity. That, in some ways, the combination of the two, the way they cooperate and work together in tandem, is what gives rise to a form of power called the secular, which is oftentimes ineffable, which can only be analyzed through its different traces that you find in different societies. So I think this distinction between political secularism, the official doctrine of separating politics and religion, whereby politics is oftentimes associated with everything that is rational, like law, deliberation, things that have to do with the public sphere, and then religion is oftentimes equated with things that have to do with irrationality, the private sphere, mysticism, superstition, etc. How political secularism is distinct from this category of secularity. Secularity basically means the kind of dispositions, the kind of attitudes, the kind of sensibilities that amplify secularism, like privileging modern science over religion, like privileging the individual over external forms of authority, the inner piety over external authority, etc. So how secularity and political secularism come together to give shape and weight to a form of power called the secular, that has very specific origins. It has very specific European origins in the post-Westphalian world, but then now has traveled around the world in a way that it impresses upon liberal sort of Muslim commentators. It impresses upon Muslim and non-Muslim states. It has become a global, universal form of power. So what Sabah Mahmood and others have shown is that this kind of power and its assumptions about good religion, although it poses itself as universal, as applicable to every society, as a normative good that everyone should aspire to, it actually has very specific local origins. And rather than embracing the story that it tells about itself, one ought to think critically about it. One ought to interrupt its normalizing, its universalizing tendencies, and find alternate forms of power and logics by doing more energetic readings of the tradition. For someone like Sabah Mahmood, that was the ethnography that she did in her famous book Politics of Piety, or the way she looked at the permeation of these concepts in modern Egypt by looking at questions of minority rights and tolerance, etc. In my case, it was looking at this intellectual tradition and debates in South Asia. So I think that is what is needed, to not submit to the authority of or the supposed alleged universality of liberal secular power, but to question it and find alternate logics of life.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And there's this book that I'm reminded of called The Myth of Religious Violence. And in this book, the author does a very good job at showing how this trans-historical or trans-cultural concept of religion as something that is inherently and essentially prone to violence is one of the foundational legitimating myths of the liberal nation state. So this myth that religion has some dangerous proclivity to violence that liberalism then comes and regulates and controls is the myth on which liberal nation state stands. So this myth of religion's intrinsic propensity to violence, or in this case Islam's natural proclivity to violence, what it does is that it helps construct the other of liberalism, that is an Islam that is not moderated by liberal force, that is not regulated by secular power, that is not remade in the image of Protestant Christianity. So a Muslim who believes in such an Islam then is contrasted with the rational, peacemaking, secular subject of liberalism. And the violence that Muslims do, and the violence that Islam legitimizes, is therefore presented as irrational and fanatical, and the violence of secularism, the violence of liberalism, is presented as rational and peacemaking. And Professor Salman Saeed also speaks about this in his book, and there's this small paragraph that I feel is worth quoting here because it captures the essence of the point that I'm trying to make here. He says that the underlying assumption behind attempts to equate secularism with civic peace is that religion is dangerous because its ability to incite hostility and violence is unparalleled. So secularism then operates as a name for the commitment to anti-dogmatism. It presents itself as a medicine against the violence of religion. Now, why should religious passions be more violent than other passions, for example, secular passions, liberal passions? The response to this question usually takes the form that if someone thinks that they are on a mission from God, they are unlikely to be dissuaded by objections on more mundane grounds, nor are they likely to see themselves as being participants in a dialogue. This response, however, is not really about religion, but about claims that a higher authority is validating one's position or one's right to commit violence. Now, this higher authority, moreover, does not have to take the form of God or gods. According to Salman Saeed, it can and has, throughout colonial history, taken the name of history, science, or reason. Much of the colonial violence that happened in the name of rationality, happened in the name of developmentalism, and not in the name of God. So, in this regard, it could be argued that what secularism does is that it helps to hide the higher authority claimed by some groups against claims made by other groups, and does so by reproducing the colonial drama in which the West has science and the non-West has superstition and religion. So, Professor SherAli, if we build on this, I've heard many people, many scholars equate secularism with tolerance. And despite the critique of liberal discourse on tolerance by scholars like Wendy Brown and Talal Asad, this equation of secularism with tolerance has persisted. Now, for someone like Sabah Mahmood, for instance, secularism does not have much to do with tolerating difference or celebrating diversity, but more to do with remaking or constructing certain kinds of religious subjectivities, certain forms of religious expressions, so as to render them compliant with liberal political rule. To put it simply, the promise of tolerance that secularism offers comes with a condition of transformation, which is to say, in the case of Islam, only if Islam were to transform itself, remake itself, remodel itself in ways that make it acceptable to core assumptions, to core sensibilities of secularity, would it be tolerated. So, for you to be eligible for secular tolerance, you have to transform yourself. For you to be eligible for secular tolerance, you have to secularize yourself. Now, tolerance here, therefore, does not remain a virtue. It's an act of epistemic violence. Because how is this promise of tolerance that secularism offers any different from the promise of tolerance that the proponents of Hindutva in India offer to Muslims? They are also promised tolerance, but the condition of tolerance is that they have to shun their Muslimness, they have to shun Islam as it is, and they have to embrace an Indic Hindu civilizational identity. So, would it be wrong if I say that secularism through tolerance, or rather secularism by tolerating Islam, remakes it in very profound ways? How would you see this?
Absolutely. Now, I think you've really framed it very nicely. You've really framed it very nicely, and I would encourage listeners, in the last 3 minutes, the things that you've said, you've really framed things in a very eloquent and precise fashion. That's precisely the problem. One of the major contradictions in this very idea of tolerance, here I'm drawing on this theorist Wendy Brown, which is that when you say that I tolerate you or I tolerate so-and-so person, the underlying conundrum or the underlying contradiction there is that there must be something wrong with you. There must be something really putrid or something really problematic with you, such that I have to quote unquote tolerate you, right? So the very gesture of tolerance, the extension of tolerance, in some ways is an acceptance of the fact that there must be something problematic such that you are worthy of being an object of tolerance. So that in some ways is the underlying contradiction in this idea of tolerance. But you're absolutely right. This idea, the question of the very pressure to be tolerated, right? This very pressure to be seen as being a properly moderate subject, the very pressure of being seen as someone who has quote unquote assimilated, the very pressure of being seen as a good Muslim. These are very strong forms of pressure that sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, I think in some measure, most Muslims in the world today confront. Some resist, some embrace, some very willfully and gleefully embrace, and others perhaps with more hesitance. But these are very profound and powerful forms of discourses, state and non-state practices, which also pervade the academy. Even among many sort of scholars and thinkers who would be on the front lines of this new trend of decolonizing things, etc. So you're absolutely right. There is a certain kind of a pervasive assumption that Professor Salman Sayyid talked about, whom you interviewed earlier in one of the chapters of his excellent book, Recalling the Caliphate. I think his chapter on secularism should be a must-read for every student of the humanities and others, where he really brings this point home, that this assumption that religion ultimately is a form of phenomenon, that is a kind of phenomenon that, if left unchecked, that if left unmoderated, that if left uncontrolled, will spill into violence. This underlying assumption that we also find in the work of someone like Asad in his, one of my favorite texts of his is on suicide bombing, where he talks about this very binary between violence and politics. That the kind of violence which might be committed, by the suicide bomber. And Asad's point, of course, is not to endorse that. That would be a very lazy reading of that text. But the kind of politics which is inaugurated by forms of violence committed by Muslim actors are seen as antithetical to politics, as antithetical to any kind of life. But the kind of violence that comes from the modern states and modern empires, in the form of drone attacks and other kinds of indiscriminate violence, etc., is seen as either violence of necessity, where if lives are lost, it would be a form of mistake which is committed by otherwise rational actors, or which is seen to be inaugurating a sort of useful form of politics. So this very binary between violence and politics, where the very foundations of Western modern states or Western modern democracies is based on violence, is something that he questions in very profound and interesting ways in that text on suicide bombing. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's the interesting thing here is ways in which these different categories operate together as family concepts, right? This idea of tolerance, this separation between violence and politics, the separation then between the religious and the secular, the public sphere and the private sphere, between rationality and irrationality, between law and emotion, and so on. So I think the interesting thing to notice here is different forms of power and discourses operate together as family concepts to exert their power, to exert the normativity of certain forms of life, and the normativity of forms of life which conform with either modern Western forms of good religion, where religion is not really taken that seriously, right? That's basically the assumption. Don't take it too seriously, or else it will spill into violence. Or a religion which is conducive to modern state governance and sovereignty. So to come to the earlier point you were making a bit earlier, that people quote references from the tradition and say, oh, secularism is not external to Islam, it's not foreign to Islam, but there can also be an Islamic secular. That I think is a very problematic category that some very accomplished scholars of Islam actually mobilize frequently. The problem in that category is that it does not attend to the idea that even if the word secular existed in the pre-modern period, right, the idea of worldly forms of conduct, the idea of seculum or worldly practices, etc. Even if the word predates modernity, the way in which the grammar of this concept has transformed in modernity and how it has become entangled with modern state sovereignty and the moment of and the processes of colonialism in different parts of the world, that transformation in the grammar of concepts that Talal Asad always points us to, building on Wittgenstein, that's what people miss out when they talk about the Islamic secular, or when they sort of quote references from the Hadith or elsewhere to try to make the point that this is some kind of this is indigenous to Islam, etc. The very thing you're talking about is not the same as what existed in the pre-modern period. The very concept of the secular as some kind of a form of power which can then be separated from, or can be, is the opposite of religion, is a very modern sort of conceptual form of framing that you find. So, oftentimes you find people quoting this hadith of the Prophet, that, the Prophet was asked for advice by, a farmer about how to sort of what to do with his crops, and he gave an advice, and the crops did not come out well. And then the farmer asked the Prophet, what happened here? And the Prophet replied that on matters of religion take my advice, but when it comes to matters of the world, follow your own judgment. I'm paraphrasing the hadith here. People so oftentimes quote this hadith to say that the Prophet himself made a separation between worldly spheres of life and religious spheres of life, and so on and so forth. what that kind of a reference completely misses out is that, that notion of the distinction between the worldly and the devotional does not does not correspond to the modern state's regulation of religion as a form of discourse that is conducive to its own sovereignty and governance. It does not map onto the kind of moderation of religion that gives rise to a normative notion of religion, which corresponds to modern Protestant understandings of authentic and good religion. So, so this category of Islamic secular is very conceptually and historically problematic. And it is not tenable if you do a close reading of Asad, Mahmoud, and important exponents of critical secularism studies.
Absolutely, this is a very common practice. I've come across people trying to de-link secularism from its Eurocentric origins, and they universalize it, and knowingly or unknowingly they present the history of the West as the history of the world. So Western experience or Western history becomes universal history or universal experience. And as Salman Said argues, that when they make this case for non-Eurocentric or non-European antecedents for secularism, they introduce this divide of the religious and the secular into the historiography of other societies that do not locate themselves within Europe. And in doing so, they further reinscribe and reinforce the Western hegemony or the hegemony of Eurocentrism. So, Professor SherAli, taking this conversation forward, I've noticed that since 2014, many scholars in Western academia, including Indians and Pakistanis, have started talking about the Islamophobia of the Indian nation state. They have started talking about the violence that Muslims in India face on a daily basis, and some of them have also started talking about the violence that the Indian state perpetuates against Muslims in Kashmir, though the nature and cause of this oppression is almost always obfuscated. So, for instance, it's primarily framed as an issue of human rights violations, when in fact all the human rights violations that occur in Kashmir occur as a result of the condition of colonialism and military occupation, a condition that is not spoken about. But what I find more interesting is the fact that in all these conversations on India and Islamophobia, there is this romanticization of a pre-BJP secular liberal Nehruvian India, and this exceptionalization of Modi and his BJP. Now, what this romanticization does is that it completely obfuscates the fact that the otherization of Islam and the violence against Muslims in India is not a phenomenon that is exclusive to BJP's India, but its history goes back to 1947. And when you speak about the occupation of Kashmir, it did not begin in 2014, it began in 1947. And in all the ideas of India, whether secular or non-secular, and at times these two overlap, the occupation of Kashmir has remained integral. The colonization of Kashmir has remained intrinsic to all ideas of India. The justificatory logic might vary, but the occupation has always been there. Now, what's interesting is the fact that much of this academia was completely silent about the violence that Muslims in India faced before 2014, as is evinced by their romanticization of that Nehruvian secular India. And much of this academia has historically been silent about military occupation of Kashmir, and some liberals, Indian liberals and liberals elsewhere, have also gone on to rationalize India's colonization or occupation of Kashmir through same colonial or Orientalist logics. So, Professor SherAli, do you think this silence of the academia on the violence that happened against Muslims in India before 2014 and the occupation of Kashmir that goes back to 2014 has to do with the fact that much of this academia is incapable of reconciling secularity or liberalism, of which they see Indian National Congress as an embodiment, with imperial or colonial oppression? And they have started talking about Islamophobia and Muslims in India now simply because the violence today is marked by an outward, manifest Hindu religiosity, Brahmanical religiosity, and secular gaze and secular logic can only see oppression in terms of religion, can only talk about oppression when you can blame religion or some interpretation of it for the oppression. When the oppression is produced by secular liberal power, that times what we notice is complete silence. So what do you say about all this?
Yeah, I think the last thing you said is actually very, very critical in terms of addressing this question, which is this underlying assumption or rather, I should say, this inability to connect or to recognize the ineluctable intimacy between colonialism and eventually the rise of the modern nation state, um, and operations of secular power that present religion as the opposite of the secular, as a form of life that always ought to be moderated, domesticated, controlled, kept a check on, or else it will spill into violence. So, this whole discourse of ways in which the modern state becomes the arbiter of religious difference and of religion in the public sphere, uh, and that in some ways becomes the linchpin of its sovereignty and of its claims to governance and of being the manager of difference in any society. So, this intimate relationship between the sovereignty of the modern state, its sort of histories of colonialism, and the operations of liberal secular power that presents religion as the opposite of the secular. So, this intimate relationship is not recognized or is not, uh, 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 in some ways, appreciated when we make these kinds of distinctions between religious nationalism and forms of Hindu nationalism, which is seen as the ultimate problem, but again, some reversion to secularism, some reversion to a golden past, which is built on some notion of secular India or a Nehruvian legacy, etc., is seen as the solution to that problem, etc. Now, it might be an intellectually, somewhat reasonable argument to make that the forms of violence and the forms of suppression, the forms of discrimination that you found in the present moment are slightly, or have different kinds of modalities than they may have had a few decades ago, etc. So to chart specific differences between the two modalities of violence, that you might have found in the pre-BJP era and the BJP era itself, that's an analytically, I think, a reasonable project to even with colonial power. Colonialism is not some kind of a monolithic entity. Colonialism also changes its logics and shifts its grammar of how it organizes its power. So to track those shifts in logics, I think, is a reasonable sort of analytical activity, or a reasonable form of inquiry. But to posit this kind of a sharp break between some era of religious nationalism, of Hindu nationalism and Hindu majoritarianism, and then to have some kind of a pre era, which was one defined by the panacea of secularism, where the drug of liberal tolerance was more readily available, is historically inaccurate and problematic. It does not recognize the intimacy between secularism and modern state sovereignty, and frankly, does not recognize the intimacy between colonialism and secular power. So I have the position that there can be no there can be no analytically and politically sophisticated notion of decolonial politics. This, a buzzword today. Unfortunately, it has become a buzzword. It's a very important project, I must say. Um, but everyone seems to be riding on the bandwagon these days. But coming back to my point, which is that there can be no analytically or politically viable notion of decolonial politics that does not combine a critique of the modern nation state, a critique of histories of colonialism, with a more critical attitude towards liberal secular power. Now, which is not to say that liberal secular power is some kind of a monolithic entity which does not have different varieties, which does not have different shifting logics, etc. Of course, it's not a monolith. But at the heart of liberal secular power, whatever forms it takes, whatever modalities it adopts, is a certain notion of religion as a category of life which, if left unchecked, will spill into fanaticism and violence, or to produce a notion of good religion which comes closest to a certain modern Western Protestant notion of good religion, which is conducive to modern state sovereignty in the West and in non-Western contexts. So I think to have any politics or analytical project of decolonial politics, a critique of secularism has to be its departure point. Which is not to say that it is a rejection of secularism, but it is a more critical attitude towards the self-congratulatory narrative that secularism narrates about itself, which is then embraced by different subjects in places like South Asia and elsewhere. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, for example, recently with the passing of Dilip Kumar, people saying, oh, he was the quintessential Hindustani. He was the quintessential sort of symbol of Hindu-Muslim collaboration, or some notion of Hindustan, which in some ways, transcends the violence and the trauma of partition and this kind of ways in which South Asia has descended into these religious differences and violence, etc. I mean, the guy had to change his name from Yusuf Khan to Dilip Kumar to be even seen as recognizable, to be seen as popular. I mean, the guy had to literally change his name. He literally had to de-Islamize his very identity, the very name, right? So that the very signification, to use the category by this very interesting historian, Brent Turner, who's written about African American Islam, and especially the Nation of Islam and its history, in a book called The African American Muslim Experience. I'm forgetting the exact title of that book. It has a yellow cover. It's an excellent book in which he talks about ways in which people like Malcolm X and others really used signification, naming as a profound form of political action to critique histories of slavery and forms of white power and racism, etc. So to present Dilip Kumar as some kind of a sort of a great symbol of Hindustan and Hindustani Islam is just plain stupid, I must say. And it has a nefarious kind of a liberal secular politics at the heart of it.
Absolutely. And I would like to add one quick thing to what you just said about the problem of Hindu nationalism or Hindu majoritarianism in India. Many people, especially from the Eurocentric left, would posit secularism or secularization as a possible solution to this problem of Hindu majoritarianism. But I would argue that such an assertion is a product of a very flawed, a very limited understanding of what secularism is. Instead of seeing secularism as merely a separation of religion and politics, as Sabah Mahmood argues, we should see it as a statist project which claims to make religious difference inconsequential to politics, but at the same time, it embeds majoritarian religious or ideological norms in state institutions, law, and practices. So there's this unavoidable sensitivity that secular democratic governance shows to majoritarian cultural or religious sensibilities. And Sabah Mahmood argues that this sensitivity is internal to secular logic. So it's not as though when a secular democratic governance takes into account majoritarian religious sensibilities, it's not being truly secular. Rather, this sensitivity is internal to the very logic of secular democratic governance. And Hussain Agrama, who has written extensively on secularism, in his work argues that there's this fundamental contradiction that is internal to liberal democratic legal tradition. So it's at the heart of it. So on one hand, secular liberal governance claims that everyone is equal before the law. But on the other hand, there is this aim of the law to create and maintain public order, an aim that necessarily means that the attitude and the concerns of the majority population would have to be prioritized. So when people argue that secularization is the solution to Hindu majoritarianism or Hindu nationalism in India, they do not take into account the fact that secularism is not the absence of religion. Rather, it always entails the embedding of majoritarian, which in this case would be Hindu, religious norms in state institutions, law, and practices. So, Professor SherAli, moving forward, I want to ask you about identities and the conditions of the possibility of an identity, about the formation of an identity. Now, when Muslims engage in dialogue with other people, and most of the times this dialogue is marked by an asymmetrical relationship of power. But when they engage in these dialogues, it is expected of them that they must leave their Muslimness at their homes, that they must leave at their homes all that makes a Muslim a Muslim. To put it simply, it is expected that Muslims must transcend their own Muslimness and Islam in order for them to be admitted into this terrain of dialogue. Sometimes it is expected that they must shun Islam or at least privatize it and embrace humanism or embrace universal reason. But nobody tells us what exactly does humanism mean and who defines what universal reason is. So how would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'll say three brief things in response to those excellent set of comments you've made. First, on this whole idea of dialogue, he said, when Muslims are invited to dialogue. So I think we need to think about the whole question of what is the terrain? What is the terrain and set of conditions in which this supposed invitation to dialogue is given? And to, as you rightly pointed out, to think about the uneven power relations and the set of expectations, the rules of this supposed dialogue are rules which are oftentimes not of the making of Muslims, right? And that's the whole point of colonial power, that it's not just new forms of discourses that become emergent, but also the very terrain in which different actors are now supposed to be dialoguing each other is a terrain which is not of their making. Which is not to say that Muslims don't continue to contribute intellectually, and there is tremendous intellectual vitality and creativity, etc. As my whole book in some ways is about Muslims who were, faced with the condition of colonialism, but yet were able to, engage in a very fierce but extremely complex and fascinating debate about what a normative Muslim identity should look like in this condition of colonialism, and they had different readings of the tradition, etc. But we do need to think about the uneven power relations in which the supposed dialogue is supposed to happen. So it's not really dialogical, this dialogue. So that's point one. The second point about this whole idea of, shun all religion and become humanist. People who say that, oftentimes it's unintentionally, people may not be familiar with this whole critique of secularism, this whole sort of discourse, etc. And part of the challenge is now to make this this form of inquiry, to make this form of a critical way of looking at these categories like secularism more commonplace, to translate it in a language that does not lose its sophistication and its analytical purchase, but also becomes more easily understandable and accessible to a larger set of people. Because part of what makes this project so difficult is that this very sort of normative assumptions about what secularism is has become so pervasive, has become so entrenched in people's imaginaries, both in the global north and the global south, in academic communities and in non-academic communities, that sort of questioning and disrupting that is very challenging. But it's a challenge that is absolutely critical. There's no way without that challenge. But the point I was making is that, as you said, this whole notion of humanism is, of course, coming from a certain tradition of Protestant Christianity. It is a deeply, thoroughly Western Christian idea that you will only be seen as properly normative, that your normativity, your ability to be seen as a good human subject in the modern world depends on you shunning your forms of piety and your sort of doxological and ritual pre-commitments. That once you have moderated yourself, once you have sort of shunned your own religion, that is only when you will be seen as acceptable and as normatively sort of viable in the modern world. So that's a thoroughly modern Protestant notion. So anyone who says that, I want to be a humanist, should buy a T-shirt which says colonial agent. That sounds a bit harsh, but that's exactly what it's the logic of colonialism embedded with logics of Protestant Christianity. And the third thing that I would say, which, by the way, is the point of, I think, one of the most profitable articles of Professor Sabah Mahmood, Religious Reason and Secular Affect, an incommensurable divide, which is about the whole Danish cartoon controversy, which I have analyzed in that chapter that I talked about earlier. But her main sort of argument precisely was that you can't look at this whole sort of controversy through the lens of it's a debate between religious taboo against images or cartoons of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and secular freedom and freedom of speech. She shows a very sort of identifiable, very clear Protestant Christian histories of the notion of freedom of speech. And she does that in remarkable ways in that article. So we can't we can't look at this without the sort of specific modern histories of Protestant Christianity. The third point I want to make very briefly is that this whole approach of trying to identify and locate good Muslims and trying to identify and locate good actors in the historical arena also informs the kind of choices we make oftentimes in terms of which scholars we focus on, which sort of scholars we write more about and less about, and what forms of discourse get more amplified and presented in the historiography. So I think it is worth asking, why is it that ulama traditions of South Asia, although there has been some very important scholarship, especially in the last 20 years, but it's why does it not get the same kind of coverage from, for example, as anti-colonial activists or say nationalist actors, or those actors who may have been more aligned with the Indian National Congress, who are presented in a particular kind of way? I think it has to do with a certain kind of politics of the present, whereby the very pressure to find good Muslims in the historical arena is so intense, and is so sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious, that there is this kind of a way in which Muslims who are seen as good Muslims are presented as good Muslims then. So, take the example of someone like Abul Kalam Azad that we were talking about before we, started our formal conversation, who's oftentimes presented as this great pluralist, or, allied with Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, talked about sort of Hindu-Muslim camaraderie and friendship. All those things are true. I mean, I've also written about this. But, in some ways, he also was someone who was an advocate of jihad against the British, who actually was very invested in preserving the caliphate, who in some ways was an Islamist in many ways in trying to preserve and curate a certain notion of a Muslim state. Or someone like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who's seen as this great modernist who built this institution of Aligarh, which is a counterweight to the supposed Puritanism of Deoband. But when you look at his writings, he's heavily sort of invested in ulama traditions of knowledge, even though he was critical of many aspects. Recently, I've been reading a text of his on dining with non-Muslims, in which he tries to make a case for, in fact, being able to dine with British and sort of Christians, etc. But in that very text, which is heavily saturated in Hanafi fiqh, he actually is damning in terms of some Hindu rituals and Hindu subjects, etc. So, when you actually look at their texts and their thought, the kind of caricatured sort of ways in which they're oftentimes presented as the good Muslim or the pluralists or the modernists, it does not really hold. So I think this is also very important, to not look at this historical arena and the past through the prism of our modern politics of trying to find good Muslims who can then act as a good counterweight to supposedly bad Muslims who take the Sharia too seriously. That again is a very impoverished way of looking at this tradition, and one ought to think about this tradition and these actors beyond these kinds of binaries like inclusive, exclusive, modernist, traditionalist, the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. And that's precisely what I try to do in my first book, and what I'm also trying to do in my second book on intra-Muslim debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship.
Absolutely, that's very well put. And that brings me to a question that many people wanted me to ask of you, which is that when Muslims in Kashmir struggle against colonization, or when Muslims elsewhere struggle against imperialism or the conditions of coloniality, it is expected of them that they must not have Islam as the logic or the symbolic force of their anti-colonial resistance. And this is expected of them even by the people who claim to be anti-colonial and pro-self-determination. So Muslims are expected to do their politics only in terms that are intelligible and acceptable to either a secular liberal framework or a leftist Marxian framework. Now, do you think that this discourse on decolonization that is imposed on Muslims is simply another mechanism through which Eurocentrism reinforces itself and reinscribes itself in the lives of Muslims by again telling them that the proper place of Islam in their lives is in their homes? And also, when Muslims do their anti-colonial resistance in Islamic terms, then many of these liberals draw an equivalence between these Muslims and their oppressors. So, by doing their politics in a non-secular Islamic framework, they become simply as bad as their oppressors to the liberal gaze. So, what would you say about that?
Yes, absolutely. And this comes back to a point that we were earlier making, which is that, um, and this is, of course, a point that other scholars have also made in very convincing ways, that at the heart of the very logic of the project of colonialism and colonial power, in some ways, the very authorizing logic of Western colonialism, um, is in some ways um, the secular logic of seeing religion as a phenomenon that, if left unchecked, will either spill into violence, or that its excess will inhibit the project of curating a just or a stable political order. So this very secular principle of moderating religion and seeing religion as the opposite of the secular is foundational to the logic of colonialism and colonial power. And hence, if this is the kind of logic that governs your thought, or that governs implicitly or explicitly the way you look at it, that could not be called decolonial. It can only be called recolonial, or reinforce colonial power in some ways.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. I think, and that this whole idea, you are very correct to say that it's very pervasive in discussions on Kashmir, when you have these different flash panels that are oftentimes held, even and especially commentators who might be sympathetic to Kashmiri people, or at least outwardly sympathetic or very critical of the Indian state, and have this oftentimes have this narrative that you talked about earlier, about this radical separation or distinction between the current Indian state and its previous instantiations of Nehruvian secularism, etc. Who oftentimes I've seen pointing out that the Kashmiri struggle is not to be conflated with places like other places in the Middle East, or it should not be conflated with other movements like Hezbollah, etc., because they're not really into religion as much, or this is a very peace-loving valley, and this kind of orientalizing of the natural beauty which goes with the peace-loving, inclusive nature of the people, etc., which are all very sort of colonial orientalist tropes in some ways, which, as you pointed out before we started recording our conversation, or we went live, so to say, that religion and Islam is central to the struggle against this settler colonial occupation. So this whole quest to de-Islamize is, in some ways, the underlying assumption there is, the secular assumption, that one ought to manage, check, and contain the excesses of religion. What that does is, the interesting thing is, what that does is that it produces and it presents a certain definition of what religion is. It produces a certain kind of definition of religion, that is then to be separated from, or that is then to be presented as the opposite of the quote-unquote secular, or quote-unquote political. So in some ways, the secular and the political is then presented as the opposite of the religious and the apolitical, or the anti-political, etc. So yes, coming back to that underlying point, that until and unless we see the intimacy between the discourse of secularism and the operation of secular power and the historical moment and repercussions of colonialism, there can be no decolonial politics. And this is a point that is made very convincingly. A text that I found most convincing on making this point is this book by this scholar called Arvind Mandair, called Religion and the Specter of the West, which actually is on the whole history of Sikhism and its sort of translation as a world religion. But he makes this point very convincingly, that to think about the intimacy between secularism and the very foundational logic of colonial power. But this is something which is very critical, but not very pervasive in some ways. So what we're talking about is in some ways still a minority position, and but we have to keep talking about it in more convincing ways.
completely agree. And Professor SherAli Tareen, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned a lot from you and it was wonderful speaking to you. And thanks to everyone listening. We'll be doing our next podcast on the myth of Pandit Exodus from Kashmir and the forms of politics that this myth has produced and the way it has supported India's colonial project in Kashmir. Thanks to everyone listening again. Allah Hafiz.